This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Europe's earliest history stretches back tens of thousands of years, to the era when the first humans set foot on the continent. Around 50,000 years ago, Palaeolithic hunter-gatherers gradually migrated from Western Asia and left behind remarkable evidence of their lives, such as cave paintings, as well as stone and bone tools. Much of the northern part of the continent was covered by massive glaciers during this time, but as the Ice Age began to come to an end around 12,000 years ago, humans moved more permanently into these areas also, and thereby came to inhabit the entire continent, stretching from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. Life continued in much the same way for thousands of years, up until the 7th millennium BC, when a revolutionary change swept across Europe and irreversibly transformed the lives of all humanity. The practice of farming, centered around cultivating crops, domesticating animals, and permanent settlements, was introduced to Europe from the Middle East, replacing the itinerant nomadic camps of hunter-gatherers which had been used for millennia. As these early European societies became more settled and advanced, megalithic stone monuments, like that of Stonehenge in England, began to be constructed, reflecting the new forms of daily life built around communities and religious ritual. Further technological advancement came with the development of metallurgy in the 5th millennium BC, as the first copper tools, ornaments, and weapons were made. Much of this change was introduced by the Indo-European peoples who migrated westward across the Eurasian Steppe around 4500 BC. They not only brought more advanced technologies with them, but also a set of languages, the ancestors of Latin, Greek, Germanic, and Slavic, which would soon take hold across Europe and came to form part of a wider language group that stretched all the way to the Indian subcontinent. The beginning of the Bronze Age around 3000 BC saw more complex societies begin to develop, particularly in the Mediterranean. Many of humanity's earliest civilizations had taken hold in the Near East, and it was owing to this proximity that Europe's first known literate civilization emerged on the island of Crete. The Minoans were a maritime trading power who developed commercial connections across the eastern Mediterranean and consequently brought many of the cultural and technological advancements of the region back to their island. They built large stone palace complexes, such as that at Knossos, and adorned them with some of the finest artworks early Europeans ever produced. The Minoans were followed in later years by the Mycenaean civilization on the Greek mainland, which began around 1600 BC, and which spoke an early form of the Greek language. Within a few centuries, however, the Bronze Age world would suffer a sudden and dramatic collapse. Across the eastern Mediterranean, several civilizations ended abruptly around 1200 BC, possibly due to a combination of invasion, internal strife, and environmental crises. What followed was a period known as the Greek Dark Ages, with the once thriving populations of the region becoming silent, and the technological and cultural knowledge they had developed over the past centuries being lost. Elsewhere on the continent, other early European cultures and civilizations remained little affected by the calamities that had befallen the eastern Mediterranean. Across what is now Austria and Germany, the Celtic Hallstatt culture rose to prominence and would soon spread across much of Western Europe. In Italy, the ancestors of the Etruscans were beginning to emerge, and across Scandinavia and the British Isles, a thriving Bronze Age continued to flourish. But it was only with the arrival of the 1st millennium BC that the light of advanced civilization began to re-emerge. Out of the darkness that had taken hold in Greece, cities like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth began to trade across the ocean once again. They established contact with the Phoenicians of modern-day Lebanon, from whom they adopted a new alphabet, which allowed for the reintroduction of reading and writing. This redevelopment of a common language saw further advances such as a shared religion, forms of government, legal codes, as well as new cultures and learnings to emerge in the form of philosophy, science, mathematics, sports, theatre, and music. Armed with this new knowledge of the world around them, the Greeks began to expand beyond the realms of their own borders and founded numerous colonies along the shores of the Mediterranean and Black Sea between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. Back in Greece itself, Athens had become the leading cultural and civic centre of Europe by the 5th century BC. It pioneered the use of democracy and was home to great philosophers such as Socrates and Plato, as well as monumental architectural landmarks such as the Parthenon, all of which combined to form the foundations of what would one day become the hallmarks of Western civilization. The developments made by these Greek city-states were nevertheless delicate and fragile. At the start of the 5th century BC, they faced the threat of being absorbed into the expanding Persian Achaemenid Empire, which tried to bring Greece and its unique civilization under its sphere of influence. Despite repelling the invading Persians in battle on numerous occasions, like those fought at Marathon and Plataea, internal conflict among the Greeks soon followed, with a long protracted rivalry between Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War of 431 to 404 BC. Although Sparta eventually won out, it ultimately left Greece as a whole weakened, and, in the aftermath, a new Greek kingdom of Macedon rose to prominence. After King Philip II conquered all of Greece, he was followed by his son, Alexander the Great, who embarked on an extraordinary campaign to conquer the rest of the known world. Beginning in 334 BC, Alexander marched east, and within a decade had toppled the vast Persian Empire, extending Greek rule as far as Egypt and India. His empire was nonetheless short-lived, for he died just a few years later, in 323 BC. But, on the other side of the Mediterranean, a newly emerging power was on the rise, one that would leave a long-lasting impression across the continent, which is still visible to this day. The city of Rome was reportedly founded by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus in 753 BC. Its formative years were ruled under a monarchical system of kings, but by the year 509 BC, it had evolved into a republic, governed by a senate. After expanding across the rest of the Italian peninsula and the surrounding shorelines of the Mediterranean by the 3rd century BC, the Romans went on to conquer the dominant superpower in the region, Carthage, during the Punic Wars of 264 to 146 BC. The Roman Republic eventually gave way to the Roman Empire at the end of the 1st century BC, and the subsequent rule of the emperors saw Rome's borders expand further to reach the height of its imperial and territorial might by the 2nd century AD, under Emperor Trajan. Covering approximately 5.9 million square kilometers, it extended across parts of North Africa and the Middle East, and encompassed the greater part of the European continent, as well as a vast and diverse range of European tribes and cultures. This included not only the Italian peoples who formed the bulk of the Roman citizenry, but also the Iberians, Basques, and Lusitanians of Spain and Portugal, the Gauls of France, the Celtic Britons, as well as some Germanic tribes, in addition to Illyrians, Thracians, Dacians, and Greeks across the Balkans. The Romans brought with them laws, road networks, a common administrative language in the form of Latin, and a powerful army which built and garrisoned many of Europe's first proper towns and cities, including London, Paris, Cologne, Zurich, and Vienna. The Romans were well known for their deployment of strategy and tactics in the ancient world. But if you've ever wanted to take command on the battlefield yourself, then why not download and play War Thunder, the sponsor of this video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available now for free on PC and consoles. Take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armoured cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. Join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today, and delve into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. One feature that we particularly like is the game's sophisticated vehicle damage models, which intricately show individual components, like engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew, all of which are susceptible to damage from enemy fire, just like their real-world counterparts. We'd recommend War Thunder to anyone with a fond interest in history, as you can get as close as virtually possible to taking command of a genuine historical war vehicle, which you can customize with countless camouflages, historical markings, and decoration options. Play War Thunder now for free by using the links in the video description or pinned comment to sign up. New players, and those who haven't played in 6 months, will also receive a massive bonus pack on PC or consoles that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator, Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. Available for a limited time only, so don't miss it. Life across Roman Europe during this time came to be seen as a golden age, or the Pax Romana, owing to the relative peace and stability of the period. This allowed for intellectual and cultural life to flourish, with key figures like Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Virgil, Horace, and Tacitus producing works that shaped Roman philosophy, literature, and history that have lasted throughout the ages. However, from the 3rd century AD onwards, the Roman Empire entered a period of severe instability marked by plagues, economic decline, and relentless civil war. Alongside some institutional changes intended to strengthen the empire during this time, a far more profound religious transformation would occur that would transform and dominate the lives of Europeans for centuries to come: the adoption of Christianity. What had started out as a minority sect in Roman Judea quickly spread across the empire and into Europe during the early centuries AD. Despite widespread persecution by Roman authorities, some of the earliest churches were established in cities like Rome, Athens, and Lyon during this time. But the most significant developments of the faith came when Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan formally permitted the religion to be practiced within the empire in the year 313 AD, which was later followed by Emperor Theodosius I's declaration, which made it the official religion of the empire in 380 AD. Although the Roman state continued to falter and subsequently split into 2 separate entities by 395 AD, the Christian Church grew in influence and cohesion to fill the power vacuum and lay the foundations for a religious landscape that would dominate Europe for millennia. Beyond the empire's borders existed a patchwork of European peoples, otherwise known as barbarians, which the Romans had failed to win over either militarily or culturally. This consisted primarily of the Germanic tribes scattered across what is now Germany and Scandinavia, as well as the early Slavic populations of Poland and Belarus, in addition to the Sarmatian peoples who roamed the plains of modern Ukraine. However, in response to other migratory pressures from peoples pushing westwards from Asia, coupled with their own desires to exploit the weakened position of the Roman Empire, these barbarian tribes of Europe soon began to move across the borders. From the late 4th century onwards, waves of predominantly Germanic peoples began invading and later settling across what had once been Roman territory. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from Denmark and Germany overran Britain. The Franks expanded into Gaul. The Vandals rampaged south and westward as far as North Africa, and the Visigoths even sacked the city of Rome itself in the year 410, before eventually carving out a kingdom of their own in Spain. Finally, in the year 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, the young Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, an event which effectively marked the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the Dark Ages. In the aftermath of the empire's collapse, Western Europe fragmented into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms which, although they preserved some aspects of Roman law and customs, for the most part became more insular and tribal in nature. The Church nevertheless continued to operate as it had done before. Most of the European population within the former Roman provinces were already Christian, but the 5th to 7th centuries saw countless missionaries sent out to convert the remaining pagan barbarian kingdoms. Some of the earliest Germanic converts were the Visigoths, Burgundians, and Vandals, but the first major kingdom to embrace Christianity was that of the Franks, whose King Clovis I was baptized in 496. In Ireland, which had been Christian since the 5th century, a powerful monastic culture had developed, which released missionaries to spread the faith across Scotland, northern England, as well as continental Europe. The Church provided literacy, law, and organizational stability to many of the newly created kingdoms of Europe, offering monarchs political legitimacy based on a divine right to rule. In doing so, the Catholic Church established the cultural and religious environment that would define Western Europe throughout the medieval period to come. Meanwhile, in the east, the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, remained a shining light of classical civilization. The Byzantine emperors continued to style themselves as Romans and presided over a wealthy, urbanized state that encompassed Greece and the Balkans, as well as parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Constantinople was a powerhouse of economic, cultural, and military strength, making it the largest and richest city in Europe, if not the world. Much of this was owed to the preservation of ancient Greek and Roman learning, which had otherwise become forgotten in the West. Despite retaining this sophistication, the Byzantine Empire also underwent similar challenges to its Western contemporaries, namely its own religious transformation, as the early Christian church evolved into the distinctive Eastern Orthodox faith, as well as witnessing incursions into its territory at the hands of newly emergent threats. The rise of Islam during the 7th century saw many Byzantine lands in the Near East fall to Muslim forces. The early caliphates also rapidly expanded across North Africa, and by the beginning of the 8th century had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Visigothic Spain, thereby establishing the first major Islamic presence on the European continent. By around 720, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under the rule of the Umayyad Caliphate, which was threatening to advance further into Christian Europe. This expansion was only brought to a halt in the year 732, when the Frankish leader, Charles Martel, defeated the Muslim armies at the Battle of Tours. Although defeated, the Muslims of Iberia, otherwise known as Moors, subsequently established a power base for themselves across the peninsula, which came to be known as Al-Andalus, and would endure for the best part of 800 years. By the late 8th century, Europe was effectively divided into 3 religious zones, with Islam in the far southwest, Orthodox Christianity in the southeast, and Roman Catholicism across the north and centre. However, it was within this region that a semblance of imperial unity had begun to re-emerge. In 768, another Frankish king, Charlemagne, began waging numerous campaigns to expand his realm across Western Europe, conquering parts of modern France, Western Germany, the Low Countries, and northern Italy. Then, on Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III dramatically crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, thereby asserting the revival of the Western Roman Empire, at least in name. The subsequent Carolingian Empire was the largest Western Europe had seen since the days of Rome, and although Charlemagne's domain did not survive long after his death, being divided among his grandsons in the year 843, its fracture laid the foundations for the continent's central power bases to emerge in the years to come. Comparatively, much of the northern extremity of the continent across Scandinavia had been little affected by the events of the past 400 years, with most of the inhabitants of this region remaining technologically stuck in the Iron Age, and many still practicing paganism. Despite this seeming lack of progress, however, the peoples of Scandinavia were about to burst onto the European stage with a terrifying energy. The Viking Age began in the late 8th century, with raids on the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and France. Driven by a mix of political and socio-economic pressures back home, the Norsemen would go on to strike virtually every part of Europe reachable by sea or river. But the Vikings were not just opportunistic raiders, they were also explorers, traders, farmers, and craftsmen who went on to create and settle kingdoms of their own across the British Isles, northern France, Iceland, Greenland, and even as far away as North America. To the east, Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians, managed to sail across the Baltic Sea and down the great Russian rivers, trading and settling amongst the local Slavic population. Out of this fusion emerged the Kievan Rus in the late 9th century, the earliest form of the Russian state, which would come to play a significant role in the development of the region in the coming centuries. It was also in the east that another power had begun to rise during this time, the Magyars. These nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian Steppe invaded eastern and central Europe, taking possession of the Carpathian Basin, before raiding further westward into Germany and Italy. Although they were defeated by the German king Otto I at the Battle of Lechfeld in the year 955, the Magyars afterwards settled more permanently in the basin, adopted Christianity, and went on to establish the Kingdom of Hungary by the year 1000. By the dawn of the new millennium, these disruptive incursions that had rocked Europe's stability over the past few centuries had largely come to a halt, and, although the continent remained politically fragmented, it was poised for a period of stability and growth that would last for the next 300 years. The advent of the High Middle Ages saw agricultural developments, such as the heavy plough and crop rotation, introduced across Europe, which, combined with a favourable climate, led to the population increasing significantly. Many new towns and cities were founded during this time and became home to a growing, wealthy and powerful merchant class who revived long-distance trade across the continent. Despite this, most of the European population remained rural, agrarian and poor, owing to the highly structured society which governed the period, the feudal system. This strict, hierarchical system placed kings and other high nobles at the top of the social pyramid, who granted the lands they owned to lesser lords and knights in exchange for military service and loyalty. The peasants, who accounted for up to 90% of Europe's population, lived and worked on the land for their lord, providing food and other services in return for protection. Alongside the lords and peasants was the church, which owned its own lands but still relied on peasants for labour, in return for the clergy providing their spiritual welfare. Thus, medieval society was divided into what became known as the three estates: those who worked, those who fought, and those who prayed. The power and influence of the church made it the dominant feature of everyday European life by the late 11th century, but events on the far side of the Mediterranean were about to bring these deeply rooted Christian beliefs into contention with Islam in the Middle East. Beginning in 1095, the First Crusade was launched to retake the city of Jerusalem from Muslim hands. Waves of European knights and commoners alike proceeded en route to the Holy Land and captured the Holy City in 1099, creating several Western European-style feudal states across the Levant in the process. Further crusades followed over the next 2 centuries, not only in the Holy Land but also within Europe itself. The resurgent Christian kingdoms of Iberia began a reconquest of their lands against the Muslims of Al-Andalus. Likewise, the Teutonic Order orchestrated campaigns against pagans in the Baltic, and even heretical and political enemies of the papacy, such as the Cathars in southern France, were ruthlessly rooted out. Yet, as the Latin Catholic West was asserting its dominance across the continent, an altogether different power was making inroads from the east. During the 1230s and 1240s, the Mongols, who had already conquered much of Asia, surged into Eastern Europe with a speed and destructive power unlike anything that had been seen before. Kiev was sacked, large swathes of Poland and Hungary were laid waste, and several Slavic principalities were forced into tributary status under the Golden Horde. Although the Mongols eventually withdrew from Central Europe, their domination over much of the eastern frontier reshaped the region's cultural development for centuries to come, thus widening the economic and societal gap between Eastern and Western Europe. Nevertheless, the High Middle Ages were overall a time of burgeoning culture and innovation. Monumental Gothic cathedrals rose in cities like Paris, Chartres, and Canterbury. Universities were founded in Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, and Salamanca, allowing for a greater adoption of scholarly pursuits such as philosophy and literature, with famous works like Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales emerging during this time. Economically, Europe witnessed a growth in trade supported by newly established banking networks, especially in the cities of Italy and the Low Countries. By around 1300, medieval Europe had reached a high point of development never seen before, forming a landscape of productive farmland, prosperous towns, and emergent nation-states. Although all of this was about to come undone through a series of devastating events. The 14th century is widely considered to be Europe's most cataclysmic time, owing to a seemingly never-ending period of war, starvation, and disease which ravaged the continent. Recurring famines, Most notably, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 weakened Western Europe, ahead of a devastating plague known as the Black Death, which swept across the continent between 1347 and 1352, killing perhaps a third of its population. Entire villages vanished, and many at the time believed that this was the final reckoning before Judgment Day. But as the plague began to subside, a resultant labour shortage allowed for the surviving peasantry to gain new bargaining power, securing better wages and conditions from their lords and masters. This upending of the feudal order quickly led to social tensions worsening between the powerful landowning elites and the powerless, landless masses, with uprisings erupting in several kingdoms, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The authorities eventually clamped down and suppressed such uprisings to restore order, but Europe's era of instability was compounded even further by almost incessant warfare. The most damaging of these conflicts was the 100 Years' War, fought periodically from 1337 to 1453 between England and France. It wrought incalculable devastation across the French countryside, as bands of soldiers roamed from town to town, killing and plundering as they went. The conflict also saw new forms of warfare rise to prominence, such as the longbow, professional armies, and, increasingly, gunpowder artillery, which began to eclipse the dominance of mounted knights and fortified castles, signalling the gradual end of traditional medieval military systems. The crisis-ridden 14th century brought Europe to the point of ruin. However, it was out of this darkness that a light of intellectual and artistic renewal would emerge to dramatically reshape the continent's fortunes. On Europe's eastern frontier, the long-declining Byzantine Empire finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, with the capture of Constantinople. In the aftermath of this event, many Greek scholars fled westwards to Italy, carrying precious ancient manuscripts that covered the works of Plato and other Greek philosophers, as well as knowledge of science, mathematics, and theology, which had otherwise fallen into obscurity in the West. Subsequently, across the cities of northern and central Italy, a rebirth of learning and the arts developed, inspired by the classical civilizations of the ancient world, which heralded the arrival of the Renaissance. The wealth generated in the prosperous merchant republics like Florence, Venice, and Genoa had created a class of urban elites willing to sponsor painters, sculptors, architects, and scholars who sought to create new forms of human expression. Artists working under the patronage of families, such as the Medici, experimented with perspective, anatomy, and light, resulting in the iconic works of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Meanwhile, architects like Brunelleschi revived domes, columns, and harmonious proportions, transforming Italian city skylines which remain standing to this day. Accompanying this intellectual reawakening was Johannes Gutenberg's technological invention of the printing press back in the 1440s. This allowed for books and pamphlets, many of which explored the learnings and ideas transcribed from ancient Greek and Roman sources, to be published on a previously unimaginable scale across the continent. As a result, this cultural flowering, which had taken hold in Italy, quickly spread north across the Alps in the following decades of the 15th century, where it mingled with local traditions and perceptions. In the Low Countries and Germany, painters like Jan van Eyck and Albrecht Dürer combined the Italian techniques with detailed realism and religious symbolism to create their own unique artistic interpretations. As more books, pamphlets, and prints were published, literacy slowly began to rise, and with it, a public sphere for discussion and debate of new ideas began to form. Many of these emergent ideas questioned the authority of the medieval church, which for centuries had suppressed any concerns about ecclesiastical wealth, clerical misconduct, or other controversies. However, these hypocrisies would soon boil over into an open challenge that would cleave the unity of Western Christendom in two: the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, the German monk Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, criticizing the institution of the Church and challenging the power of the papacy in Rome. Protected by sympathetic German princes and aided by the printing press, Luther's writings spread rapidly throughout much of northern Europe, resulting in many kingdoms and realms breaking away from the Catholic faith and adopting Protestantism. Practically all of southern Europe remained Catholic, but in the central parts of the continent, across France, southern Germany, and Bohemia, emerging Protestant minorities clashed with Catholic majorities, setting the stage for sectarian conflict to erupt. This splintering of Christendom across Western Europe unleashed a century of religious warfare that intertwined faith, dynastic rivalry, and the struggle for state power. During the 1560s in France, conflict between Catholic forces and Protestant Huguenots produced civil war and countless massacres, before a measure of toleration was begrudgingly accepted. Likewise, in the Low Countries, Dutch Protestants revolted against their Catholic Spanish overlords, leading to a protracted war for independence and the eventual emergence of the Dutch Republic. But it was across the myriad of German lands that made up the Holy Roman Empire that one of the most devastating and destructive religious conflicts in European history would break out. The 30 Years' War, fought from 1618 to 1648, saw an estimated 4.5 to 8 million people die from the effects of battle, famine, or disease, with many parts of Germany itself seeing their populations reduce by half. Even though peace was eventually restored, Europe's spiritual unity was permanently broken, not just from the old division between Orthodox East and Catholic West, but now also with a Protestant North. These cultural, political, and religious differences spurred many Europeans to look elsewhere for new opportunities and lands that could better accommodate their personal faith, as well as advance their own fortunes. The so-called Age of Discovery had begun back in the 15th century, when Christopher Columbus, sailing under the flag of Spain, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and inadvertently discovered the Americas. The Portuguese had likewise begun exploratory voyages of their own, pushing steadily southwards down the coast of Africa and reaching India by the year 1498. These early expeditions brought Europe to the forefront of an expanding and interconnected global world, which they would come to dominate for the next several centuries. Throughout the 1500s, Spain conquered most of Central and South America from the Aztec, Mayan, and Inca civilizations. These territories were rich in natural resources like gold and silver, which subsequently poured unprecedented wealth into Spain's coffers. The Portuguese likewise built a similar, albeit looser, imperial model of fortified trading posts and colonies stretching from Brazil to Africa and the Indian Ocean, which by the turn of the 17th century had inspired other European powers to forge overseas empires of their own. The Dutch, English, and French all went on to establish their own colonies across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, often by creating chartered companies to finance and manage the risks of perilous long-distance trade. Sadly, however, this explosion in European overseas expansion became entangled with, and subsequently dependent on, the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were captured and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World by European slave traders, where they were sold and forced to work on plantations, producing crops like cotton, coffee, sugar, and tobacco. These commodities were then transported back to Europe, alongside other goods like potatoes, maize, and timber, to be sold for profit. As a result of this triangular trade, European diets, fashions, and tastes shifted to accommodate these new and exotic goods, which in turn saw new industries emerge alongside an early form of capitalism. Meanwhile, across Eastern and Central Europe, the 17th century saw a similar vein of territorial expansion unfold. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once one of the continent's largest and most diverse states, struggled to maintain its dominance in the face of increasing foreign pressure and internal factionalism. To its east, the Principality of Muscovy had spent the previous centuries consolidating power, overthrowing Mongol domination, and steadily expanding across the steppes of Eurasia to assert itself within the region. Farther south, the contest for influence in Central Europe had begun to intensify as the Austrian Habsburgs battled with the Ottoman Empire over Hungary and the Balkans. Although the advance of the Turks into Europe was ultimately halted at the Siege of Vienna in 1683, it would take the best part of 200 years before this corner of southeastern Europe would be fully relinquished from Ottoman control. Nevertheless, Europeans were not just pushing the limits of their territorial boundaries, they were also expanding their understanding of science. The 16th and 17th centuries bore witness to the scientific revolution, with some of the finest minds in Europe grappling with seemingly incomprehensible questions to make sense of humanity's place in the world around them. Astronomers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler made observations and discoveries across the cosmos, revealing a universe far more dynamic and orderly than previously imagined. Others turned their attention to nature on Earth. William Harvey charted the circulation of blood through the human body. Robert Boyle experimented with the properties of gases to define the fundamentals of modern chemistry, and Isaac Newton published his laws of motion and universal gravitation, offering a framework that would govern scientific thought for centuries to come. Together, their efforts marked a profound shift in the way Europeans understood the world, replacing the inherited assumptions of the medieval period with methods grounded in observation, experiment, and reason. Scientific societies and academies were soon founded across the continent, while journals and correspondence networks linked scholars across borders to foster inquiry and debate. The wave of scientific advancements paved the way for a broader intellectual movement to emerge during the 18th century, the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Locke and Voltaire, Montesquieu and Rousseau questioned long-standing political, religious, and societal attitudes across Europe. Many criticized absolute monarchy and the close alliance between church and state, arguing instead for constitutional limits, religious toleration, and the consent of the governed. Enlightened thinkers met in person to discuss their ideas in the ever-growing number of coffeehouses springing up across the continent, which also served as distribution centers for newspapers, pamphlets, and periodicals. Despite a handful of European rulers adopting elements of Enlightenment thinking, such as Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, most monarchs remained absolute and resistant to change. These Enlightenment ideals would, in time, come to upend Europe's political, social, and economic institutions during the latter decades of the 18th century, regardless of whether its rulers approved of them or not. In Britain's American colonies, what began as protests over taxation and representation mingled with notions of freedom, liberty, and equality. The result was revolution, followed by the Declaration of Independence for the United States in 1776. These revolutionary principles soon found their way to France, where they clashed with deep social inequality and resentment of aristocratic privilege, headed by the Bourbon monarchy. In 1789, a series of political events triggered the outbreak of the French Revolution, which, within 4 years, led to the declaration of a French Republic and the abolition of the monarchy, all before culminating in the execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793. Fears of revolution quickly spread amongst the rest of Europe's monarchies, leading many to declare war on France in an attempt to snuff out the nascent republic and extinguish its revolutionary fervour. However, it was out of this period of conflict, known as the French Revolutionary Wars, that one Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. He ultimately crowned himself as emperor in 1804, before going on the offensive to bring much of the European continent under his rule within a decade. Although Napoleon was eventually defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and the victorious nations restored the continent's balance of power, including reinstating France's monarchy, the political and ideological concepts released by the French Revolution had already taken hold in the hearts and minds of many European peoples, who were by now looking to shape their own political destinies. As the 19th century rolled on, a paradox between progress and tradition was beginning to emerge across Europe. Much of this change had been brought about by the Industrial Revolution, which reshaped daily life for more people than any other event in history. Originating in Britain in the late 18th century, before spreading across the continent in later decades, industrialization saw millions of people from the countryside move into towns and cities in search of work. New factories, mills, dockyards, and coal mines sprang up in regions like Lancashire, which soon teemed with thousands of workers laboring alongside steam-powered machinery. This mechanization of production led to an explosion in manufacturing output. But, in order to move these vast quantities of materials, manpower, and goods across the country and out to the wider world, a revolution in human transport would first be needed. The invention of the railway in Britain during the late 1820s saw the first tracks laid to connect manufacturing centres like Manchester with ports such as Liverpool. Railways soon crisscrossed the land, dramatically shortening distances and birthing the concept of train travel, as people journeyed not only across the country, but in later years, across the entire continent. Industrialization, however, also brought with it its own set of problems, as well as compounding pre-existing social divisions. The influx of newcomers into towns and cities quickly led to overcrowding, pollution, and poverty. This contrasted with the bourgeois class of factory owners, merchants, and financiers who grew increasingly wealthy on the other hand, seemingly at the expense of the workers. By the 1840s, thinkers such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels began to argue that capitalism was inherently exploitative of the lower social classes, and that workers would eventually overthrow their bourgeoisie masters. This birthed the motion of the socialist movement, which would come to dramatically reshape the political layout of Europe in the coming century. In the meantime, to counter these emerging socialist policies, many European governments gradually broadened their political systems to allow more of the male population to vote. The result of this was that many countries became more nationalist in nature, with several new nation-states unifying in the second half of the 19th century, most notably Italy in 1870 and Germany in the following year. The continent was becoming increasingly divided among powerful and competing nations, who were determined to expand and dominate their rivals at any cost. For the most part, this led to a renewal in imperialistic endeavours in regions across the world that had not already been dominated by Europeans. Colonialism of past centuries had focused predominantly on the Americas, but as most of the colonies there had by now become independent from their European overlords, focus shifted instead to Africa and parts of Asia. European powers divided practically the entire African continent among themselves in the latter decades of the 19th century, drawing borders with little regard for existing ethnic or political realities. Britain and France acquired the largest domains, but Belgium, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain also claimed territories. In Asia, a similar pattern emerged, with Britain consolidating its rule over India and extending its influence into Burma and Malaya. The French established control over Indochina, the Dutch tightened their grip on Indonesia, and Russia expanded across Central Asia and Siberia. Even where formal colonization did not occur, such as in China, the technological and military superiority of the European powers at that time saw many unequal treaties and spheres of influence belligerently imposed. Back in Europe, these imperialistic overtones fused with national pride to create an intense rivalry among the continent's great powers. The unification of Germany and its rapid industrial growth produced a formidable new power that was seeking prestige. This raised tensions with Britain, which began a naval arms race, and with France, which nursed grievances over the loss of Alsace-Lorraine from the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. In Eastern and Southeastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires struggled to contain nationalist movements among their diverse subjects, especially in the Balkans, where Slavic nationalism intersected with Russian ambitions. Europe gradually divided into two major alliance blocs, namely the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Many leaders believed that these alliances would deter war, but in reality, they created a dangerous and volatile geopolitical atmosphere that could explode at any moment. The spark that ignited it all came in June 1914, when the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. Within weeks, a complex chain of mobilizations and declarations of war plunged Europe into World War I. What many expected to be a short, sharp conflict became a 4-year catastrophe. On the Western Front, German attempts to quickly defeat France stalled, and trench warfare set in, with offensives that cost hundreds of thousands of lives for negligible territorial gains. On the Eastern Front, campaigns were more fluid but equally deadly. New weapons such as machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, tanks, and aircraft combined with mass conscription to produce casualties on an unprecedented scale. By the conflict's end in 1918, the strain of total war had brought down several ancient regimes. Russia, convulsed by revolution, saw the Tsarist autocracy replaced first by a provisional government and then by a Bolshevik regime committed to building a communist state. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire both fragmented, and Germany, facing military defeat and domestic unrest, saw the Kaiser abdicate and a republic declared. The peace settlements, most notably the Treaty of Versailles, redrew the map of Europe, resurrecting old or creating new countries, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, all the while imposing heavy territorial losses and financial reparations on the losing side. The interwar years saw moments of apparent stabilization. Some economies recovered as cultural life flourished in cities such as Berlin and Paris, and international agreements sought to limit rearmament and normalize relations. Women gained the vote in several European countries as societal norms relaxed. Yet the underlying political and economic structures of many European states remained vulnerable. Most of the new countries formed in the aftermath of the First World War had little experience of parliamentary democracy and were burdened with ethnic tensions and border disputes. The global economic crisis of the Great Depression had reached Europe by the 1930s, causing mass unemployment and bank failures, which quickly undermined confidence in liberal democracy and created fertile ground for emerging extremist movements. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already seized power back in 1922, establishing a fascist regime that glorified the state, suppressed opposition, and dreamed of imperial revival. In the Soviet Union, Stalin consolidated his brutal dictatorship over the country, launching forced collectivization and rapid industrialization at the cost of famine, repression, and terror. In Germany, the trauma of defeat in the First World War, plus resentment over the Treaty of Versailles and the economic shock of the Depression, served as fuel for Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party to rise to power. Appointed Chancellor in 1933, Hitler quickly dismantled democratic institutions, persecuted opponents, and enacted racist laws that stripped Jews of citizenship and civil rights. His regime's combination of aggressive nationalism, militarism, and racial ideology aimed not just at revising the post-war settlement, but at fundamentally reshaping Europe by force. A series of territorial annexations by Nazi Germany across Central Europe in the late 1930s led Britain and France to pursue a policy of appeasement in the hope of avoiding war. But these concessions ultimately failed to satisfy Hitler's ambitions. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, leading Britain and France to declare war, thereby marking the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. Within a matter of months, German forces had overrun most of the continent, leaving Britain as the only nation still standing in the west, as well as the Soviet Union in the east. Under the cover of war, the Nazi regime implemented the Holocaust, the systematic murder of over 6 million Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and many others. Collaboration and resistance became the only way of effectively fighting back for most of Europe's occupied populations. However, following the United States' entry into the war in 1941 and the Soviet Union's victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, the tide began to turn against Nazi Germany. The remaining years of the war in Europe saw the Allies gradually advance on Germany from both directions until, in May 1945, following Hitler's suicide and the fall of Berlin, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Europe emerged physically and emotionally shattered by the conflict, as well as economically exhausted. The old European great powers had been brought to their knees, while two non-European nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, now dominated the global stage. In the years that followed, Europe was divided into two opposing ideological blocs in what became known as the Cold War. In the West, the United States provided economic aid to help rebuild war-torn economies and stabilize democracies in countries such as France, Italy, and West Germany. Many Western European states became founding members of the NATO Collective Defense Alliance and gradually moved towards economic integration, beginning with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and the European Economic Community, established in 1957. These institutions aim not only to promote growth, but also to bind former European rivals together so closely that war between them would become practically unthinkable. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union installed communist regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, all linked through the Warsaw Pact and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Any form of political dissent or reform in these nations was brutally suppressed, such as in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, which were both crushed by Soviet intervention. Germany itself was divided, with Berlin becoming a front-line symbol of this division, following the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, which physically sealed off East from West behind the so-called Iron Curtain. Despite the ever-present possibility of nuclear confrontation, Western Europe experienced an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity in the post-war era. Economic growth was rapid, living standards rose, welfare states expanded, and consumer goods such as cars, televisions, and household appliances became commonplace. Former authoritarian regimes in southern Europe, such as Greece, Portugal, and Spain, gave way to democracies in the 1970s. At the same time, European colonial empires began to be dismantled as independence movements across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean took hold, forcing the likes of Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Portugal to relinquish control. Decolonization transformed the global order and reshaped Europe's relationship with the wider world, as new migration flows opened, bringing people from Europe's former colonies to the continent. By contrast, in Eastern Europe, economic stagnation, food shortages, and political rigidity gradually eroded the legitimacy of communist regimes. Although some reforms were attempted, the system's structural weaknesses and the burdens of maintaining control over restive populations became increasingly evident. As a result, during the 1980s, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev sought to revitalize socialism through reforms, relaxing censorship and signaling that Moscow would no longer use force to prop up its satellite states. This shift opened the door for a wave of peaceful revolutions across the Eastern Bloc in 1989, as one communist government after another collapsed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November that year became the defining image of this transition, as Germans from both sides dismantled the symbolic barrier that had divided their city and the wider European continent. As the Cold War ended, many new European nations emerged as sovereign states, bringing with them their own sets of challenges and opportunities. Many of the former communist countries embarked on difficult transitions, privatizing state industries, creating new political institutions, and seeking integration with Western structures. NATO and the European Union both expanded eastwards, but at the same time, the collapse of communist federations in the Balkans produced a series of violent conflicts. Yugoslavia's breakup led to numerous atrocities being committed in Bosnia and Kosovo during the mid-1990s. International interventions and peacekeeping operations eventually stabilized the region, and some successor states, like Croatia, went on to join the EU and NATO. In the early 21st century, Europe has remained relatively peaceful and prosperous by historical standards, but it has not been free from strain. The global financial crisis of 2008 exposed weaknesses in the EU's monetary policy and triggered a sovereign debt crisis in several countries, particularly Greece. Similarly, the arrival of large numbers of refugees and migrants since 2015 has tested Europe's capacity for solidarity and sparked intense debates over borders, identity, and humanitarian obligations. Populist and nationalist parties subsequently gained ground in several countries, challenging established political ideas and questioning aspects of European integration. Perhaps the clearest example of political disillusionment was Britain's decision to leave the European Union in 2016, showcasing that integration and political consolidation were not irreversible. Today's Europe remains a patchwork of independent states, although many are closely linked through political, social, and economic institutions. Yet recent years have seen something of a return to the division and conflict of decades past, With Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, this has served as a stark reminder to the nations and peoples of Europe, proving that, just as it has done so throughout history, the continent is too vast, diverse, and complex for any one singular form of unity to exist. It will always remain contested. Shout out to War Thunder again for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check out War Thunder now for free on PC and consoles, and use the links in the video description as well as pinned comments to register. Those of you who are new or haven't played for 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles, including multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more.